Governor, thank you so much for doing this interview. I want to talk about the state of your campaign. You have spent about $50 million so far, and you're about 50 points behind Donald Trump. Are you running out of time?
Well, they haven't spent that. That is now in the hopper, so you're going to see a lot of that coming in the next couple months. We're focusing on a state-by-state strategy because that's how this process works. People can take a poll nationally, but we don't run a national primary, so we're on the ground in Iowa. Everybody there has said we've done better there than anyone can remember in terms of what we're doing. We're doing similar stuff in New Hampshire, so that's what we're going to do, and we're going to get the job done.
Are you betting everything on Iowa?
We're going to win Iowa, but I think that there have been people who've won Iowa who didn't end up going on to win the nomination. The goal is to win a majority of the delegates, and so that's what we're going to do.
What has been the main challenge because the former President Donald Trump still remains so dominant?
Well, look, I mean, the last however many 4 or 5 months have been dominated by these legal cases, and that's unprecedented. And I think that took a lot of oxygen out of the room. I mean, I launched my campaign. We're going in the early states. We're getting all this buzz. Then the next week, you have a case that comes down. And then that was 100% of what people were talking about. So that's challenging, but at the end of the day, I think our voters are going to start processing what do we do in the future. And in my view, is very simple. If this election is about the past and focusing on other things, we're not going to win. If the election's about the future for American families and the country, and we show where Joe Biden's failed, then we're going to get the job done and we're going to win.
If it's not about the past, do you believe that voters will elect someone who is facing 91 criminal counts?
So I didn't think even before all this that the former president should have run again. I mean, I think that there's too many voters who he's a deal breaker for them.
Nikki Haley says Americans won't vote for a convicted criminal. Do you agree with that?
I think the chance of getting elected president after being convicted of a felony is as close to zero as you can get.
Let's talk about some of the issues that matter most to voters. How does a President DeSantis get inflation down?
Stop spending so much money. We need a president that's going to be a force for spending restraint because that's one of the root causes with Congress spending so much. 2, open up domestic energy production. Energy costs are a huge part of inflation. I know Biden he's gotten rid of a lot of the strategic petroleum reserve. I think that's not ultimately that's a Band-Aid. So open up domestic energy. Let's lower gas prices, lower fuel costs for people.
The Saudis announced they will continue to cut production 1 million barrels a day. Would you as president call up MBS and say, end that?
We would definitely do that. We use the leverage we needed to, but we are going to use more of our productive capacity here. We have the ability to be the dominant energy power in the world if we will just simply embrace that. Biden's gone in a different direction. He's focusing on other issues, but from an oil and gas perspective, nobody could compete with the United States if we just use the resources that we've had. And I tell you this, if you look at national security, we will be stronger in terms of national security if we are energy dominant.
There's a new report out that former President Donald Trump and his advisors are discussing aggressive new tax cuts if he were to win a second term. Do you have a plan on cutting taxes? What is it?
So we are going to be rolling out some tax plan. I mean, we're going to have low, transparent, simple rates. We're not going to raise taxes. The government's already taking in a higher percentage of GDP than at any time, I think, since the Second World War. So we don't have a taxing problem. We have a spending problem.
On that issue of spending, the issue is that, in fact, Republicans, and under Donald Trump, he added $8 trillion to the debt. And as Nikki Haley pointed out during the debate, Republicans have earmarked more in spending bills than Democrats do. Do Republicans have a spending problem?
Yes, of course. This is Republicans and Democrats in D.C. that have done this. This is not just one political party. Republicans talk big when they're out of power, but when they get in, they don't put their money where their mouth is. And you know, you're right. Donald Trump added almost $8 trillion to the debt in 4 years. He ran saying he was going to eliminate the national debt, maybe over an 8-year period, but he did make that promise, and they did the opposite.
Promise.
Well, of course it is.
This is my 7th presidential campaign. Every single Republican says they're going to cut spending and make Congress cut spending. It never happens.
Well, here's what you have to be willing to do. You have to be willing to veto bills that are spending too much money.
President Biden says global warming topping 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 10 to 20 years is scarier than nuclear war. Do you believe that humans contribute to climate change?
I don't believe what Biden is doing, that this is somehow something that's going to be a major catastrophe for us in the next 10 or 20 years. I think that there are changes, and I've always acknowledged it. And in fact, in Florida, we've put in programs to help adapt to some of the things that we've seen with our coastlines and some of the flooding. That would be the approach I would take. I would not try to kneecap our economy and our energy production. I certainly wouldn't make us more dependent on China like he wants to do with these electric vehicles. And so it's just, and I also, I have people come up to me now, and these are like friends of mine, and they'll say that their kids are worried about even having families now because of climate change. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, that is not healthy to be scaring people into saying that maybe you wouldn't even want to have a family because of this. What's
so
also...
You don't think climate change is real, that the globe is warming?
No. Well, I think that's measurable, but
you don't
I think
we should be honest with our children about what they face in the future.
Well, but there's a difference between observing what's happened and then predicting catastrophe in the future. And there have been a lot of predictions of catastrophe. I know as Florida, there's people that said Florida would be underwater by the 2020s. And that hasn't happened. But the issue is okay, what are you going to do? And what I find on a lot of the people that are very aggressive on this is it's more about ideology. For example, a lot of them don't like nuclear power, which is very clean. A lot of them are very opposed to natural gas. But if we took natural gas and exported that to where these developing countries were using that instead of coal, that would be the biggest reduction in emissions that we can hope for.
So is climate change inevitable, or do you believe that leadership can turn the tide?
I think what we need to do is do things that are going to strengthen our economy and our country, and you can adapt to what is going to happen. But the idea that if we just kneecap our economy, we're going to change the direction of the global climate, that is not going to be the case, and I just think we need to be honest with people about that.
Let's turn now to women's health and abortion rights. There is new data out that the number of abortions in Florida has actually increased, and increased since Dobbs. For those who oppose abortion rights, is it time to enact a national ban on abortion?
Well, here, the issue with Florida is that the southeastern states have very, very strong pro-life laws. Florida is litigating under a 15-week, and so we have become, against our wishes, a destination. Now, we've also done the Heartbeat Protection Act, which would go into effect once the courts clear this, which I think would probably stop the whole abortion tourism thing. So we don't want to be an abortion tourism destination.
Why won't you answer that question?
What do you mean?
About why you would support a federal ban?
I support pro-life policies. I'll be a pro-life president. But at the same time, I've got to chart the course and be honest with people about, okay, how do you advance the ball like we did in Florida? And the way you do that is really bottom up.
We asked the governor whether the penalties mentioned in Florida's 6-week ban would include women.
We have no criminal penalty. The penalties are for the physician.
Governor, I read the bill. It says just this. It does include jail time and fines for, quote, any person who willfully performs or actively participates in a termination of pregnancy.
And that's for the providers. It is not for the women. We've litigated this.
Is a woman not actively participating in the termination of her pregnancy?
No, because she's not a medical practitioner. There are
so
no
you
women.
are not for criminalizing women?
No, absolutely not. And that will not happen in Florida.
What about women who are traveling across state lines to get an abortion? Should they face criminal penalties?
Well, we cannot do that as a state anyways. I think that would be unconstitutional to penalize travel from Florida to another state, and I've not supported that for really anything. But, a lot of these women, they don't get any support. They have a father abandons them. They don't have the resources. Now in Florida, we've done a lot to try to help on that. But a lot of these folks are very vulnerable. A lot of them don't want to do an abortion, but they feel like they have no other option. And so that's part of the reason why I've never supported penalties against women.
Let's talk about national security. You are here in New York to mark 22 years since 9/11 and those attacks. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi citizens. Should Saudi Arabia be held accountable?
So what I said yesterday when I was with the 9/11 families, they should have the answers about all these documents. I mean, we still have a lot of documents that have not been declassified. I've supported the ability for them to sue in this case that they're suing. There may need to be some changes to law so that that can be brought better to fruition. So I think people should be held accountable who were involved, and we do need all the facts. I mean, this is 22 years later. They should have access to those documents.
How did 9/11 affect you?
Well, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and particularly when the Berlin Wall fell, I mean, this country had not a care in the world, it seemed like. We were on a holiday from history, and it was a great time to actually grow up, and then 9/11 just changed that. It brought reality to our shores, showed us that this is a dangerous world. It affected me personally because I ended up serving in the military as a result of that. It led me on a life of service, and then to just be there yesterday with the families, you know, it's still very raw, even 22 years.
The National Defense Strategy describes China as the most consequential strategic competitor for the coming decades. President Xi has ordered the Chinese and his military to be ready by 2027 to invade Taiwan. We are facing a conflict with China. As Commander-in-Chief, would you send in U.S. military forces to defend Taiwan?
China is by far our top national security threat. I think a lot of people realize that. I don't think as many realize it as possible. I think the President Biden, when he says he wants China to do well, I don't think he's seeing the threat for what it is. And so what we will do when we come in, we will marshal hard power in the Indo-Pacific to be able to deter them from taking that step. We don't want a war with China. We want to prevent a war with China. I think the way you prevent the war is through strength and having a strong military. When you're weak, when you're sending mixed signals, that invites Xi Jinping to do something like that. He's going to make a calculation about what the risks are versus the benefits. Doing an amphibious assault is very risky to begin with. It's a very difficult military maneuver. Obviously, they also have cyber. They have other capabilities too. But our strategy will be a strategy of denial, to deny them the ability to do that effectively. And I think we can do it, but we need to change policy.
I was just in the South Pacific on the USS Nimitz. I've seen firsthand, I've spoken with Admiral Paparo and others about the deterrent factor of the US Navy and other forces that are out there. The question is, though, if China invades Taiwan, would you commit US military forces to defend Taiwan?
Taiwan is an ally. I've been very clear on that. We have very long-standing US policy about how we project our actions and intentions regarding Taiwan. You will see a continuity of that with me as president. And I would also note that in addition to our forces in the region, you have the Japanese that are building up their military. The Koreans and the Japanese are getting along because they see this common threat of President Xi and his ambitions. But another thing we have to do too, it's not just about military.
Do you give Biden some credit for that, since he just had both of those leaders at the White House?
Well, to what end? I mean, I think that'll be the question. I think it was the right thing to do that, but you've got to be committed to having a stronger footprint there. I have not seen that commitment yet. But we also have to understand, why is China a threat at this point? A lot of it's because our economic policy in this country, going back 25 years, bringing them into the WTO, most favored nation, they have made out like bandits with that. They have massive industrial capacity. They've used that wealth to increase their military. So we need to disentangle our economy from China. We need economic independence from the CCP. We will get that done as president. In Florida, we actually prohibited CCP and its affiliates from purchasing land in our state, farmland, land their military bases. So we've recognized the threat, and as president, I'll do that as well.
Kim Jong-un is just arriving in Russia to meet with Vladimir Putin. Russia wants more weapons to send to Ukraine. If Putin gives the North Koreans advanced nuclear technologies in return, how would you respond to that threat?
Well, we have to obviously keep Kim Jong-un in a box. This is a very irrational individual. He's prone perhaps to do irrational things, and so we will work to put him in a box and to keep the pressure on Kim Jong-un.
Would you, as Commander-in-Chief, authorize a preemptive strike against the North Koreans?
Well, look, anything you were talking about, yes, if you knew that there was definitely someone was about to launch a missile at you, of course you take action to prevent and protect your people. but that would require a certain amount of evidentiary threshold. I don't think you just go willy-nilly and say we're just going to start using force haphazardly. You've got to have a basis to be able to do it. But yes, if there's a fleet of ships coming towards our Pacific coast, do you have to wait until they actually fire on the United States? If you see the hostile intent, you would be able to defend the country.
Would you meet with Kim Jong-un?
I would not meet with him without conditions. I think that when you do something like that, there's got to be a framework in place where you're going to get something out of it. You don't want to legitimize him by doing a dog and pony show and then have nothing to show for it.
Vladimir Putin, would you meet with him?
I'd say the same thing. I mean, I think that it would have to be set up for there to be something productive to happen. I wouldn't want to legitimize him, and so we would view it the same way.
Kim Jong-un traveling to meet with Vladimir Putin. How dangerous is that?
Well, what you're seeing is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, all the bad guys. If you listed the people that have a hostility to the United States or conflict with our interests, that's the cadre of people that do that. And so they've been brought closer together, over these last many years. I think that there's some differences in their interests that perhaps we can exploit if we're smarter going forward. But the reality is Iran has been a big backer of Russia. China, of course, is a big backer of Russia. And now with Kim Jong-un, they're all working together, and that's not good for this world.
One of the things that has brought Russia and North Korea closer together is Ukraine. You made a mistake by calling the war in Ukraine a territorial dispute. How long should the U.S. be involved in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I mean, that was characterized as me saying somehow that somehow Putin didn't invade. I did, of course, I had said that from the beginning. He did, but there's a difference between a war that is being done to take out the Zelensky government, which I think was probably his initial aims. The Zelensky government is not going to fall as a result of what's happening. So they are fighting over this Western territory. They're inch by inch even. This is like a World War I type of trench warfare. So that's an accurate...
Well, Russia already took Crimea. They want more than Crimea. This is all of Ukraine that they're fighting for.
Where the conflict is, they're fighting on the border between Russia and Ukraine on the far eastern part of the country, and that's where they're going back and forth on. And so that is something I think the Ukrainian sovereignty, how this works out, I do anticipate them to be able to retain their sovereignty. How the Donbas and the Crimea, obviously that's going to be an issue going forward.
But you view this as more than a territorial dispute.
I view it as something that ultimately we want to bring to an end. I mean, that's the interest of the United States. We don't want wars breaking out in Europe, but we also don't want to get dragged into the war with U.S. troops or anything like that. And when I hear some of the rhetoric that is being done, saying that this is kind of the freedoms on the line, all this stuff, you got to win. They don't define what winning is, but to me, that opens the door to say we need to have U.S. troops in there to be able to, finish the job. And I don't think U.S. troops should be involved. I think the Europeans need to be doing more. They are not pulling their weight on this. Russia is ultimately a bigger threat to Europe than it is to the United States of America. I want to be good allies with the Europeans, but we are going to insist that they do more, and the goal should be not to escalate this conflict, but to bring it to a conclusion.
I noticed you'd said that in the debate that Europe should pull their weight and do more, so I went and kind of looked at the numbers. As you know, many of these countries are sending F-16s. They're sending tanks.
Poland is, yeah. I think some are really doing. I think
Germans,
Poland is.
Britain.
I think Germany can do more. France can do more. And then also just the overall defense posture that these countries have had. They should have 2.5% of their GDP going to defense. I mean, that should be the ticket to be able to be a member in good standing of NATO, and they haven't been doing that. So we've had a situation where U.S. really provides the blanket security for Europe. And the problem with that is I don't think we have the capability of doing that while also doing what we need to do to deter China. I do think you have to make choices. Europeans may be aligned with us on peace in Europe. They're not necessarily aligned with us on the threat of China. Some are, some aren't, and that's fine. But if that's the case, then they should do more there. We'll take the lead working with our Indo-Pacific allies in China and make sure that we're not shirking on that responsibility.
You turn 45 years old this week. want to talk about age.
That's right, I forgot about that.
Age has become an issue in this presidential contest. Should voters worry about the ages of President Biden and former President Donald Trump?
I think that's absolutely legitimate concern. The presidency is not a job for someone that's 80 years old, and there's nothing, wrong with being 80. Obviously, I'm the governor of Florida. I know a lot of people who are elderly. They're great people, but you're talking about a job where you need to give it 100%. We need an energetic president, and I think that if the founders could kind of look at this again, I do think they probably would have put an age limit on some of these offices. I mean, it seems like our leadership class now in Washington, 75, 80 plus years old is where those folks are. And I think Americans, if Biden's the Democrat nominee, I'm the Republican nominee, I think there's gonna be a lot of Americans that are gonna wanna see a generational passing of the torch.
Mm-hmm. The NAACP issued a warning earlier this summer saying that Florida is, quote, openly hostile for African Americans, people of color, and LGBTQ individuals. As president, you would represent the entire country. Can everyone feel welcome in a DeSantis America?
100%, and that is politics. That's a stunt that they're playing. They obviously have very left-wing agenda, which I don't begrudge them that, but in Florida, our unemployment rate amongst African Americans is way lower than New York, California, and these blue states. We have more black-owned businesses in Florida than any state in the United States. I have more African American students on scholarships for our school choice program than any other state in the United States. And so we've shown people can succeed in Florida regardless of their race, ethnicity, any of that. We will judge people as individuals. We want people to rise up based on their merit. But here's the thing.
Because of your policies in Florida, there are minorities, Black Americans, and there are people who are part of the LGBTQ community who think that you would discriminate against them.
Well, part of the reason they think that is because of narratives that are put out by media. I mean, for example, when we had the fight with Disney over the elementary education about should you have things about sex and gender identity, telling a second grader that their gender's fluid, we said absolutely not. Parents in Florida agreed, and throughout the country, I think, agreed with that. That was termed by the media as don't say gay. The bill did not mention the word gay. I never said that gay people wanted kindergartners to be told they can change their gender. That was the media that created that and the left that created that. There were a lot of gay people in Florida that felt that was unfair to them because they didn't think it was appropriate.
When is the right age to talk about gender identity?
Well, I think the idea that a teacher would say, yes, you can change, and there's some schools around the country where they say it's okay to transition a kid without the parent's consent or knowledge. Mm-hmm. And as a parent, that is just unacceptable. I mean, schools serve an important function, but to be intruding into a family matter like that, I think goes beyond what is appropriate. And here's the thing, are we doing so well as a country on math scores and reading scores and science? Why don't we focus on those things? That I think unites everybody regardless of their viewpoint. And I'm not saying be negative about, the gender identity stuff. I'm just saying I don't think it's appropriate to have in there at all. So I think we did the right thing on that. And I think most people of all different persuasions agree with the stand we took. But I think it's also important to say, I've got people moving into Florida in record numbers. We are the #1 fastest growing state, and we are the state with the most net domestic in-migration. And that's people from all walks of life that are coming, and they're coming because the state is successful and they have an opportunity to get ahead.
Most gay people say they knew they were gay since they were a kid, but they've known most of their life they were gay.
But here's the question. What does that have to do with math class or English class or history class? So
well, should they feel accepted in schools?
Everyone
should there be tolerance?
Everyone should be accepted, 100%.
When the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade, was passed, there was included in Justice Thomas's opinion talk about the gay marriage decision. Would you support a Supreme Court that overturned gay marriage?
Well, I mean, I would appoint justices. I mean, in terms of the justice I would appoint, they will interpret the text, history, and structure of the Constitution, and they will do that faithfully. I've already said in terms of Obergefell that what the court pointed out and the other justices was reliance interest is important with respect to precedent. And I think all those other 8 justices have signaled that because there's a significant reliance interest that they would not view that the same as they did with Dobbs. And I think that's likely to be the case going forward. I don't think you're going to see them reevaluate that.
I know you're a lawyer. It sounded a lot of legalese.
No,
just to clarify,
but these are legal decisions. I mean,
you would not appoint additional justices that would overturn gay marriage.
It was a 5-4 decision, as you know. I mean, it was a very controversial decision, and so I think that the 4 justices, as a matter of first principle, thought that the majority got it wrong. But I think those justices now, except for Clarence, are basically saying, hey, there's been a lot of reliance on this, and so as you go back to reevaluate, that's going to be an issue, and that was not the same with Dobbs.
We're in New York. We've heard the mayor here say that this city's about to go bankrupt because of the migrants that are in this city. You supported sending migrants to states and cities in the Northeast too. Why do you support that? And what would you do in terms of immigration?
Well, we need to stop the problem. I mean, so I'll shut down the border. I will end these bad policies. Yes, we'll build a wall. We'll lean against the drug cartels. I mean, part of it is the drugs pouring in are killing tens of thousands of Americans. You also have criminal aliens coming. There's sex trafficking, human trafficking. There's a lot of stuff. But just the sheer number of people, New York City is an example. You can't, as a society, just have people pouring in. It taxes social services, education, healthcare, all these different things. It's not the way to run a country. And what's happened, though, is because some of the sanctuary jurisdictions, who were very high on virtue signaling when this wasn't affecting them, have now had to acknowledge that this is untenable for a country to operate this way. We have no idea who these people are. So with me as president, that ends on day one. Yes, Texas, Florida has helped transport, but we shouldn't even have to be in that situation. I think we're actually in a point where you're going to have bipartisan agreement to say, okay, the experiment with open borders has failed. Let's secure borders, and that's true for voters across partisan lines. There's a lot.
President Bush got this close, and it didn't happen.
Well, but that's because what they want to do is they want to do a big amnesty or anything. Let's get security done.
George W. Bush wanted amnesty. He would disagree with you on that.
Well, I think they called it comprehensive immigration reform. You can't. That's not going to work. You have to say we have a problem at the border. Let's fix the problem. I think you can do a lot by executive action. You may need Congress to tweak some of these things. I mean, for example,
you can't just shut down the borders. There has to be some legal pathways for immigration.
Legal immigration, yes, but that's different than what's happening. And most of these people are gaming parts of the law the way it's interpreted, showing up, going illegally across the border, then claiming asylum when they've gone through 6 or 7 other countries to get there. That's not the way asylum works. I mean, we've had legitimate asylum people who probably would have been killed or persecuted if they didn't leave.
So they should be in this country or not?
No, if somebody is legitimate asylum, which I don't think these border crossers are, that's a much different thing. This is something they know if they claim asylum, they get a sheet of paper that says, come back in 3 years for a court date. Well, of course, and I've had people come up to me,
judges, yeah.
But I've had people come up to me who are trying to become citizens, and they're stuck in the process, and they say, would I be better off just showing up at the southern border? I mean, the fact that people are even asking that question shows you that this has been a major failure.
So that means there needs to be a legislative remedy.
I think
not a law enforcement remedy.
I think I'll be able to stop the illegal migration with executive action, but I do think this asylum issue should not depend on executive action. We should not entertain asylum claims that are bogus, and we got to have a system in place so that people are not given free path into this country.
On the issue of the drug cartels, you have said stone cold dead. Would you commit U.S. troops to taking out these Mexican cartels?
We are going to lean in, and we are going to defend our country. And so I was at the border in Arizona. There was one part where there was a stretch of wall. These guys are working on the base of the wall. I'm like, what are you doing? They're like, well, we're repairing it. I'm like, what happened? He said the cartels can cut through. I mean, these are big steel beams and they're cutting through, and yet they're being allowed to come in to our country. They got backpacks on with fentanyl and all this stuff. So in those situations, yes, we will have deadly force authorized.
Would you send missiles into Mexico?
We would use all available. The tactics, I think, can be debated. If you have something you want to accomplish, people would brief you on the different ways to be able to do it. So that would be dependent on the situation. But I think you're
But
totally...
launching military forces into Mexico is a much different standard. That's why I'm asking this question.
But the reality is they are overrunning our border. They're sex trafficking, they're human trafficking, and they're bringing in massive quantities of drugs. I mean, our country is being invaded and hurt by what they're doing. And the question is, do we just throw up our hands and do we say there's nothing we can do about it, or does a leader take action? Because I'll tell you this.
Is it a border, you said stone cold dead, and when you said that, that made me think this is more than a border patrol issue.
It is, and yeah, I'm gonna have the military at the border, 100%. I mean, if they're trying to break through the wall, we will have deadly force authorized to be able to stop that. I mean, if
to shoot migrants coming across the border.
Cartel members, I mean, you have to identify them as being hostile. I mean, if there's a woman with a baby, they're not a cartel member. There's not going to be authorization to just shoot somebody like that. But when somebody's got a backpack on and they're breaking through the wall, you know that that's hostile intent, and you have every right to take action under those circumstances. And if you, guess what? You do that a few times, the times are a-changing. They will have to respond to that. They're not just going to continue to walk in to that buzzsaw. They do it now because they know that there's no pushback. They know people are dying in America, and that's fine with them. It's not fine with me.
Well, Governor DeSantis, thank you very much.
Thank
we appreciate
you.
it. Thank you for this interview.
Yeah, thanks.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.